The big news of the day, for now surprisingly, aren't the usual round of balance tuning that come with every weekly reset. Instead, today we have something a bit more broad, affecting all of the specs, which are the nerfs to the Demon Hunter and Mage raid buffs. So, Chaos Brand, previously reducing magical damage taken by 5%, has been nerfed by 40%, so it goes now to reduce magical damage by 3%. Same treatment given to Mage and Arcane Intellect, which now increases Intellect by 3% instead of 5%. Now, what are the reasons for this and the ramifications for this? Because if you're not that into the power of these raid buffs, you might be a bit confused. Well, we have things like the stamina buff, the attack power buff, the Mark of the Wild of the Druid, the physical damage debuff of the Monk. So why are these two specifically being nerfed? Well, first you have the fairness angle, and the fairness angle says that Arcane Intellect was of course better than its counterpart, which is Battle Shout, because it also buffs healers. You have Battle Shout, which buffs all of the DPS scaling with attack power, and then Arcane Intellect buffing all of the range DPS scaling with spell damage, which is roughly an equal amount of DPS. However, Arcane Intellect also had the extra of buffing healers, whereas Battle Shout had the extra of buffing tanks. But in terms of power scaling, specifically just for your primary stat, it was a better value for your healer than it was for your tank. Then you had the other difference for Chaos Brand. That is because, unlike Battle Shout and Arcane Intellect, it wasn't buffing your stats, it was buffing the damage taken by the enemies. And this was relevant because there are way more specs doing magical damage that will benefit from the Demon Hunter debuff than there are specs doing physical damage benefiting from the Monk debuff. For example, even if a Frost DK scales fully with attack power, so it scales with Battle Shout, they also scale with Chaos Brand, as most of their damage is going to be Frost. You know, besides the unempowered obliterates, which will still be doing physical damage, more than 80% of the rest of their damage will be magical, therefore they won't care about the Monk debuff, but rather the Demon Hunter's magical damage debuff. And even with the War Within and with Hero Talents doing upwards of 20% of your damage, in the case of Frost, things like Deathbringer are going to be doing shadow damage. You have another example with Enhancement. Enhancement also scales with Battle Shout, attack power, but they do lightning damage, and then some fire or frost damage, which is still magical damage. You have some slight splits here and there, still in favor of magical damage. For example, Survival. Survival does most of its damage with fire, with Wildfire Bomb, with Explosive Shot, and then with the War Within Hero Talents, Sentinel is going to be arcane damage, which is more magical damage scaling. Same goes for Demon Hunter, most of his damage being chaos or fire is also going to be benefiting from the magical damage taken. So there weren't really many specs benefiting from the Mystic Touch of a Monk, for example, because you have practically just the two ranged DPS specs of Hunter, you have the two warrior specs, you have Outlaw Rogue, and Windwalker Monk being the primary benefactors of the physical damage debuff. But for practically all of the rest of the specs, including the healers, the Demon Hunter Chaos Brand was giving you a much larger effect, which is also why it makes sense to be nerfing Chaos Brand but not nerfing Mystic Touch. In fact, if anything, you probably would even have to buff Mystic Touch, or maybe change it not to scale exclusively with physical damage. That is the main agnostic objective point. Then you have the other problem, which is the synergy, which is the combos that these buffs allowed you to form. Now, you should be, of course, already a bit, at the very least, familiar with the combos this allows you to form, because we have seen them before. In fact, we have been seeing them for quite a few months when it came to the quartet of Vengeance, Shadow, Fire, and Augmentation. Now you have 1 and 2 of the raid buffs being nerfed, on top of the third one having been nerfed multiple times already. That is what you might have heard being mentioned in my videos as well, about the combos created by the combination of the magical damage debuff of Vengeance plus the magical buff of Fire Mage plus the main stat buff given by Augmentation. All these three together giving you at minimum 15% more damage done. You would get more than 5% primary stat from augmentation, another 5% primary stat from fire, and then 5% more damage done with your damage already buffed by these primary stat increases thanks to Vengeance. This of course used to be even larger. Remember the nightmare days when Ebon Might used to increase your primary stat by 10%, and you also had the closest Clutchmate's passive, which made this buff stronger outside of raids. Now it has been nerfed down to being a 5% buff without the extra power outside of raids, but it is still something that synergizes very well with certain other raid buffs, in particular the Vengeance magical damage debuff and the Arcane Intellect of a mage, because Arcane Intellect double dips on the power of Ebon Might, because Arcane Intellect increases your primary stat, and then Ebon Might increases the primary stat of other players based on your primary stat. So the mage increases your primary stat so that your Ebon Might gets stronger. Now this synergy was so strong that once you had a mage and an augmentation evoker, you might as well have brought a Demon Hunter tank to synergize even more with the magical damage being done by these two specs. And at that point, since you have the magical damage debuff tank, the magic damage Arcane Intellect buff, and you have to play around augmentation because how much it synergizes with the Arcane Intellect buff, then you might as well also bring a third caster, which is what had created this situation and these talks about this trio of Vengeance plus Mage plus Augmentation being the core of a Mythic Plus composition, which would in return automatically assume you would bring another caster to benefit from all of these buffs. And dangerously enough, checking the Mythic Plus results from the beta, we were actually starting to see that as well already in the War Within, with Augmentation being the most played DPS, Shadow Priest being the second most played DPS, and Mage between Arcane and Frost being the third most played DPS. So that was already happening in the beta of the War Within. So as Blizzard is pointing out, they are saying that they are trying to help improve the balance of caster-heavy versus melee-heavy groups when participating in non-raid content. So obviously this was not really aimed at the raid power of the specs, but rather the Mythic Plus compositions. Now, some could be saying, wait a second, if we pair together a Battle Shout now with a Mystic Touch and with another melee empowering buff, something like Mark of the Wild of a Druid, even the Mastery buff, the Wind Fury plus Mastery buff of a Shaman, wouldn't this now be more powerful than this combo after the nerfs? But unfortunately the answer is still no, because this nerf given to Mage and Demon Hunter is just a cure to a disease looking at the wrong symptom, because the real symptom of the disease is Augmentation Evoker, not the power of Mage or the power of Vengeance, because if you scroll down to the previous seasons, you already had Fire and Shadow and Augmentation, and they had no trouble being meta and being very oppressive as they have been this last season, without a Vengeance Demon Hunter. They didn't even need the magical damage debuff. Guardian Druid was just fine. If anything, it's even better. You gain 3% more damage from Mark of the Wild because of versatility instead of 5% of a Vengeance, but you also gain 1.5% less damage taken because of versatility. So it was still a very good buff to have. And if there was one constant in these groups, wasn't the Vengeance Demon Hunter, which wasn't meta in Season 2, it wasn't even Mage, which wasn't meta for a good portion of Season 3 until it was buffed again. It was Augmentation. Before this time right here, the concept of a caster comp was never a thing. The concept of, oh, Mage and Demon Hunter together are too powerful because they are buffing the casters too much was never a point. Players were never clamoring for nerfing Arcane Intellect or Chaos Brand to reduce the damage, reduce the magical damage of specs. This only became a problem after the introduction of Augmentation. So obviously, going to nerf those two raid buffs when they only became a problem after Augmentation was introduced might be curing a disease looking at the wrong symptom. So the real issue of the power of those nerfs is how they synergized together with Augmentation. Yes, they were still more powerful, as we mentioned, than the other raid buffs. Arcane Intellect because it also buffed healers, which was more relevant than buffing the attack power of tanks, and Vengeance because it was buffing way more damage done by DPS specs, because way more DPS specs do magical damage rather than doing physical damage. But it is not really helping the core issue of the caster comp in Mythic Plus. Even after these nerfs, seeing or predicting a comp like Augmentation, Arcane Mage and Elemental Shaman, or Augmentation, Frost Mage and Affliction Warlock is still more likely than a melee comp with an Assassination Rogue, a Frost Death Knight and a third melee DPS, or even another Augmentation Evoker, because the synergy these specs have is still very powerful and still hinges on Augmentation, not nearly as much on the two buffs of Mage and Vengeance. Of course, this might still go away with tuning. The concept of having a caster comp or a melee comp is something rather new. Surprisingly, before Augmentation existed, you had a plethora of different specs, both ranged and melee, being viable at the same time. Even back to Shadowlands, for example, the main comp had 2 melee DPS and 1 caster, or 2 casters and 1 melee DPS. Even before that, during the days of the Destruction and Survival, you had 1 ranged and 1 caster. Even before that, way more variety in the options of DPS. So the concept of we must have a full melee comp and we must have a full caster comp is something rather new. And the date, the beginning of this idea is pretty much here. It's pretty much visible in the timeline of the seasons of Mythic Plus. And that starts with Augmentation. So the TLDR for the change is, it's a good change. It is a necessary change because those buffs were objectively stronger than other raid buffs, but unlikely to majorly shift the power or the advantage, at the very least, that at the moment the caster comps have versus the melee comps in Mythic Plus. So we will see, of course, with further tuning and possible changes, how these things will shape up in the first season of The War Within, hoping that we will not end up in a full Doomer mode or once again total domination of Augmentation Evoker in Mythic Plus. So with this out of the way, on this Tuesday, it is now time to leave each other. We are, of course, thanking everyone for having watched the video, as well as for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, they lied to me. They said clouds and low temperatures until the end of August, and I see sun, and I see 30 degrees. This is not cool, literally.